All right, welcome everyone. We got Alan doing another rendition of the Michelson-Morley experiment demonstration or parlor trick.
Here, I'll do an at tag everyone
Okay.
as well. Here, I'll do that now.
Yeah, I just wanted to give everyone a chance to start on the same page so we don't have to backtrack. That was my bad. I should have started it way longer ago.
All right, yeah, I'll just let me know when to click it here as well, and then when you want to start. Yeah, we can wait a few minutes if you want. I just did the everyone tag, so I'm sure it'll.
Yep, I'm gonna go in. We'll go in 60 seconds. How's that?
All right, I'll start it in 60.
All right, I think we're good to go. All right. So this is the Michelson-Morley experiment, demonstration, or parlor trick. Recently in the community, there's been a big boom and bust about Michelson-Morley and whether or not it's an experiment and, what exactly its implications are. Does it disprove the ether? Does it prove heliocentrism? Who's the baby daddy? We're going to get to the bottom of it today. I'm going to make my case for it throughout this presentation. And as we go forward, we'll take breaks for like little Q&A sections, but please don't interrupt while I'm going through the slides. But the last couple of times I presented here, everyone was super chill about it, so I think we can keep it open and move forward pretty easily. So we'll go ahead and start it out. All right, so starting off, we're going to build upon the scientific method and what it is, just to start a foundation for what is an experiment, is it, how to differentiate between an experiment, a demonstration, etc. So the scientific method, what it is and what it isn't, it's not magic, and it's not a mathematical formula. It's a process of observations, and you do experiments, and the goal is to reach a theory to explain a phenomenon in an accurate way that represents reality the best you can. And the big point of the scientific method, I think, is the repeatability of the experiments. Is your experiment repeatable? Can other people reproduce the effects and all that? So, some definitions moving forward. A hypothesis is a statement that's made by a researcher that is a working assumption that is to be tested and proven. It is something that is considered true for the purpose of the investigation. Example: the Earth is round. Theory: general principles drawn from facts that explain observations that can be used to predict new events. An example would be Newton's theory of gravitation or Einstein's theory of relativity, based on a falsifiable hypothesis of phenomenon that we observe. In falsifiable and null hypotheses. So to falsify your hypothesis, um, so your hypothesis that is generated must be able to be tested and is either accepted or rejected. So based on the outcomes of your experiment, and how it aligns with your hypothesis, it's either going to affirm it or nullify it. It's going to present positive evidence for it or evidence against it. Right? It's basically how you go forward with it. So the process of the scientific method would be: step one, you make your observation of a natural phenomenon or an event, whatever, or what have you. Step two, define the problem. So ask questions about the event, come up with ways to define a hypothesis for an experiment and all that. Step three, you form your hypothesis based on, everything that you were going over earlier in regards to the event and or phenomenon. Step four, conduct your experiment to test your hypothesis. Step five, derive a theory based on the outcome of the experiment and how it aligns with your hypothesis, and how you can build, a new hypothesis based on the experimental evidence, etc. Right? So it's all based on what the outcome of the experiment is, essentially, and its repeatability. So here for the final step, we have replication, and this is in regards to, can other people reproduce your work, which is a huge factor in the scientific method, because if you're the only one that can do a certain special experiment that proves it, then you got a problem, right? Other people should be able to reproduce it under the same conditions. So step one, following the same process, we're going to analyze the heliocentric and geocentric models in the Michelson-Morley experiment. So step one, observation. Throughout the course of a year, the stars throughout the night sky change every 6 months. Is the Earth in motion with the celestial bodies, or is the Earth at rest with respect to the celestial bodies? So we have two possible answers for our observation here. So defining the problem: is the sky moving, or are we moving with the sky? From our terrestrial perspective, and using models based solely on observations, i.e., calculative models based on reoccurring cycles, there's no way to differentiate between the correctness of the axioms of heliocentrism or the axioms of geocentrism with respect to the rotation of the sky. Meaning, are we in motion, or is the sky in motion? Are we at rest? What's going on here? So there's the problem. So we're going to get into some visuals of the heliocentric and geocentric explanations here. So for example, how heliocentrism explains the difference in the sky. An example would be, an observer here would be seeing this section of the sky looking towards the sun, and then 6 months later, they would be looking in a different direction and they're seeing, a different set of stars. So this is the way that they interpret it for the heliocentric model. So the sun is doing a loop around, the Earth is doing a loop around the sun. Here's some more heliocentric models. So here we got some nice ellipses and circles. and it's all going around the sun here. We got the Earth somewhere in here, yeah, right here. So all going around in a circle around the sun. And for the geocentric models, where the Earth is in the center and everything is going around that, we have motions that look like this, and we have these epicycles here for the retrogrades. So we have various models that were put forward. So we got the neo-Tychonic model, where it's a merger between heliocentrism and geocentrism, and we got heliocentric model over here. And we just got some more patterns and outlines of the celestial bodies from our terrestrial perspective. And this would be from a geocentric perspective, where the Earth is stationary and everything is going around. So these are the kind of patterns that you would get from that, from the day-to-day motions if you were to plot them. All right, and we got the calendar of the eclipses. This is just what it would look like over a flat plane, spiraling out between the tropics and all that. So we got a quick video here of a magnetic of a magnet and a ferrocell, and it's just to show a relationship between the patterns of the orbits that they use for the geocentric model, following a natural fractal magnetic pattern. Just some cool stuff to look at and consider. So there's no audio to this. It's just a couple of quick visuals here. So we'll see these outlines, and we'll get into this. We'll get into different variations of movements of what's going on with the celestial bodies in the sun, just everything that's going on in the sky. Next slide. All right. So again, we got, if you take the orbit of Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, you look at them one by one. Like this is what you would be looking at to explain their motions in the sky from a geocentric perspective. And it looks a lot. You see a lot of the same fractal patterns with magnetic fields. Just an interesting way to look at it here. Again, got a little more of this. Same sort of fractal patterns. Okay. So getting back into the science of it. So hypothesis. If heliocentrism were true, based on the yearly cycles, the Earth is required to be in motion at a certain speed, a speed of 30 kilometers a second to be precise. In combination with that, the current electromagnetic theory was based on a stationary ether that carried the charge potential for an accelerating electric field to generate a magnetic field. That background medium that carries the charge, the charge potential, for the electric to the magnetic field induction, will also affect electromagnetic propagation in the form of resistance to the speed of c if you're in motion relative to the ether. With that understanding of the rate of induction of c from Maxwell's equations and the etheric framework to provide the mechanism for the variance of c, Earth's orbital velocity should be revealed in the form of a fringe shift pattern. The variance in c should produce a fringe shift corresponding to the amount of resistance that the ether would have on a light beam that's perpendicular to the direction of the motion around the sun at 30 kilometers a second. Imagine that you're driving down the highway and you stick your arm out your car window. Your arm will be experiencing air resistance relative to how fast you're traveling through the air. So same exact concept that they were proposing here. So for heliocentrism, so to affirm the theory, to provide positive evidence for it, they surmised that they would need 5 fringes to get positive confirmation for the 30 kilometers a second. So each fringe would be equivalent to 5 kilometers a second in their scale. A null for them would be a no fringe shift pattern, meaning that the speed of light is the same in all directions and it can't be used to determine motion in this way. And falsify would be a slight fringe pattern that's repeatable and persist with further experimentation. So geocentrism, affirmation would be a slight fringe that's reproducible, like I was saying earlier. A null would be no fringe, meaning that you can't determine anything from the speed of light in this regard because it's not producing a fringe shift. And falsified would be 5 fringes. So heliocentrism's motion would be completely would have a lot of evidence put forward for it in that regard. And then the ether So for the stationary ether framework, affirmation of that would be fringes, however slight, as long as they're outside of the air tolerance, and if they're repeatable. So for a null, I put slight fringes outside of the air tolerance and that are repeatable. And falsified would be no fringes, meaning that there's no variance, that there's no medium to facilitate a mechanism where there would be a variance in the speed of light. And let's see here. Okay. So we'll get into the Michelson-Morley 1887 experiment here. They had a concrete slab on a piece of wood that was floating in a vat of mercury here. What they were doing with this is they were taking a light beam, a coherent light beam. They were splitting it at a beam prism, and they were using these reflective mirrors to extend the distance that the light would have to travel, so that they could, get an accurate measurement of the effect that they were trying to get. But basically, all these beams would recombine, and then they would look for a fringe shift pattern that was to be produced. And that fringe shift pattern, depending on how much fringe there was, they were going to correspond that to the amount of motion that the Earth was receiving against the ether. So for experimental variables defined, the independent variable would be the orientation of the interferometer with respect to the direction of Earth's assumed orbit. The apparatus was aligned such that the arm was perpendicular to the direction of motion, which will cause it to experience a resistance to the ether, causing a variance in C, which will produce a fringe shift pattern, which is going to be our dependent variable. Changing the orientation of the apparatus and taking measurements at different times will allow us to interpret the results and establish a cause and effect relationship with the fringe shift pattern and the assumption of Earth's orbital velocity and all that. So interpretations of the results regarding the hypothesis detecting Earth's motion: 5 fringes, each fringe corresponding to 5 kilometers would be a positive evidence for heliocentrism. No fringes. C is invariant with respect to the motion of the source or observer in combination with special relativity. One could turn that null into positive evidence for heliocentrism, which is what they later did. And slight fringe with a stationary Earth with respect to an ether wind, positive evidence against heliocentrism. So experimental variables defined: dependent. The dependent variable is the fringe pattern produced, and that's going to be either produced by Earth's assumed motion through a stationary ether or a stationary Earth with respect to an ether wind. The strength of the reading, i.e., the number of fringes with respect to the independent and control variables, will allow us to narrow down a cause and effect relationship between the fringes and the variables within the experiment and the axioms of the two models in question, i.e., is the Earth in motion, or is the sky in motion with respect to a stationary Earth, right? So for controlled variables, so just to throw some out there, we got mounting the apparatus at Mercury helped keep it level when changing the orientation and all that, and it helped reduce vibrational effects. So the first experiment that Michelson did in 1881 was too sensitive to ground vibrations and just local stuff going on in the environment. So it was giving air readings. So one of the solutions that they came up with that was to put it in a vat of mercury so that it would float evenly and be, independent of that, and they could move it and get it situated and all that. So additional mirrors were added to the apparatus to increase the distance that light would have to travel, so that they could get a stronger effect on light, so that they could read, or so that they could get a stronger fringe shift reading. And then taking readings at different times, taking the readings at different times a day to isolate the assumptions about Earth's rotation with respect to the orbit and all that. So they took readings during the day and during the night. So what the implication would be there is, are you rotating into the orbit, or are you rotating away from it, and how is that affecting the readings? So here's a topographical view of that concrete slab with the mirrors and light beam and prisms mounted on it, and what happens to the path of light and where it goes. So here's the data from the paper that they published. So here's the graph for their expected fringe shift pattern to confirm heliocentrism. So right here would be 5 fringes, and this would be the 30 kilometers a second. And let's see. So this is in the solid line is what they actually got. So they got just over 1 fringe. So their interpretation of this at the scale that they were using is that they got between 5.5 and 6 kilometers a second. Now you can read in different, or you'll read in various papers, like they'll say they got between 5.5 and 7 and 6 and different numbers, but it's around that range. So there's some variance to the interpretation or whatever, but it's way less than what would be needed to provide positive evidence for heliocentrism. So they were all befuddled by this. So step 5 from the scientific method process that we were reading earlier. So conclusion and deriving a theory based on the experimental evidence. So experimental results, the fringe shift produced was 1/6 to 1/8 of that is required to provide a first order measurement of Earth's orbital velocity. So theory 1 for heliocentrism, attributing the fringe to instrumental air, and then later using postulates based on the invariance of C regarding the source and observer. You can formulate a mathematical framework to interpret the lack of fringe, i.e., Lorentz's ether theory, saying that there was ether contraction, or later special relativity, saying that there was space-time length contraction and time dilation. And using this new framework based upon the invariance of C, you can use the slight fringe in the experiment to have a correction mechanism mathematically. So this is the Lorentz correction, the Lorentz factor, they call it. So this is the amount that the apparatus would have to contract to not give you the full 30-kilometer reading and to only give you a 5-kilometer to give you that optical illusion. So this is the Lorentz factor. So this is what they ended up going with for special relativity. So note, in relativity theory, an observer outside of Earth's reference frame would not see a fringe pattern if they could observe the Michelson-Morley experiment being conducted on Earth. So, for example, if you were on the sun and you had a magic telescope and you could see a bunch of little lads doing their light experiment from the sun, you would not see a fringe pattern at all, according to special relativity. And the only reason that we saw it in our reference frame is because the length contraction already happened. So therefore, we're measuring this slight fringe. So that's the explanation that they came up with. So on the geocentric interpretational side, we could do so for the same exact interpretation. The fringe was 1/6 to 1/8 of that, which is required to produce a positive first order measurement of Earth's orbital velocity. So theory 2 for geocentrism, we could go with a stationary Earth with respect to an ether wind that follows the sidereal rotation of the sky. No second order corrections, i.e. length contraction or time dilation, or postulates are required for this interpretation. Normally, first order measurements corresponding to a viable hypothesis is the favored interpretation, as it is the highest form of evidence that can be provided by an experimental result. But for some reason, they decided to go with length contraction and time dilation, which are second order corrections. So an important thing of that experiment, to recap at the end there of the history of it, their first interpretation of the experiment was that there was no fringe shift pattern, and what they saw was due to instrumental air. It was just air tolerance, right? So that's what they said at first. And then Lorentz was like, hey, maybe there was ether contraction and the direction of motion and all that. So they were like, oh, okay, cool. We'll run with that for a bit. And because this was all about, it wasn't just about the ether, it was about heliocentrism, and it was about the motion of the Earth. And the reason that they went with that was because it allowed for the mechanism to say that, okay, even though we got a reading that was way weaker than what we needed to, we can mathematically infer that the full reading exists, but we're just seeing a fraction of it because of this contraction mechanism due to our motion through the ether and space. So then Einstein came along in 1905 and said, this is the exact same mathematical framework that Lorentz put forward, and special relativity actually adheres to Lorentz covariance, Lorentz symmetry, and all that, right? So that's not even really in dispute that they're the same framework. So Einstein comes along and says, hey, we actually don't need to say that the ether is responsible for the contraction of the mechanism. If we tie the x-axis, the direction of motion, to a fourth axis that I'm going to add called time, if we tie these together and have them contract hyperbolically, they can meet in such a way that the speed of light will be the same in every reference frame. And that's what they did, and that's what special relativity is entirely built upon. And that merging of the two of those two axes, space and time, is what is the mechanism that removes the ether from the framework of interpretation. So you know how you'll hear Einstein disproved the ether, or he removed the ether, and like, what does that mean exactly? Well, it's in reference to how he did it mathematically, and then explain the effects through what's it called? Explain the effects through the coordinate system changing, right? So this is why it was heavily rejected back in the day, because people were like, what? This doesn't make any sense. There has to be an underlying mechanical mechanism and all that, because classical mechanics and the ether theory was all the predominant theory back in the day. So overturning all that, special relativity has to be able to explain all classical mechanic effects and then some, right? So in differentiating between a relativistic effect and a classical mechanical effect is actually impossible. So it's just kind of presented in this way that this is what's been done, and everything, and then everything moving forward is like retroactively a relativistic effect. So that was the framework that they jumped into to explain the Michelson-Morley results to keep the motion of the Earth. And these are experiments that replicated the Michelson-Morley experiment and actually took it a step further and found a cause and effect relationship with what one could consider a local sun, which we'll get into later when we get into Dayton Miller here. But to close out, I'm going to get into the history of interferometry and go over the experiments that replicated these effects and show that there's a variance to see, that show that there's an absolute reference frame, that there is a background medium, and that all motion is relative to that. And that's what facilitates the variance in speed of light, and that's why the speed of light is relative to the velocity of the observer. And that the ether provides that mechanism, right? It's not just like light just decides on its own, like it's omnipresent. It's like, oh, this guy's moving, I got to go faster to catch up, or move slower. Like, no, it's not what's happening. It's relative motion to the ether, and that's what's been obfuscated through this experiment. So we're going to go over experiments after this, or after the Michelson-Morley, that show the same thing and actually take it a step further. So we got Michelson-Morley here, 1887, Sagnac, again Michelson and Gale, Miller, DeFore and Pruner, Yuri Galev, Wang, and Manera. So we're going to touch on their papers real quick, and we'll close out, and then we'll get into a Q&A on everything. So for Michelson-Morley, we already went over the predicted fringe and what they measured. And these are the this was just going over the control variables. So this was in reference to them putting the apparatus in a vat and taking measurements at different times of day and all that. So this was their experiment and their fringe reading. And remember, they got just over a fringe, but they ended up saying that it was experimental error, even though it was outside of experimental error, but it just didn't match heliocentrism's predicted amount. So they were like, they didn't know what to do with it. So they just were like, I don't know, maybe the apparatus is broken, dude. So 1913, Georges Sagnac came along, a French physicist, and with a rotating interferometer. So I don't have a graphic here, which is a mistake on my part. I apologize. But if you just recall to the Michelson-Morley device and just imagine it in a circle, right, or a triangular configuration, and then it just rotates constantly instead of being stationary when it's taking the readings. That's what this guy did in 1913. So he had a rotating interferometer, and he produced a fringe shift pattern. And so special relativity's answer to that was, hey, this is a non-inertial reference frame because it's a rotating device. So the speed of light, we're not really concerned that it's changing. So it's not a falsification. And then later in 1918, Paul Lavoux, using a special metric tensor that he and a couple other people derived to explain angular momentum conservation on the small scale. They were able to say through general relativity that the rotation of the device was equivalent to generating enough energy to make time dilation and length contraction happen. And so they explain the Sagnac effect through general relativity, through rotation, and saying that the energy of that is equivalent to generating what would be required for the apparatus to length contraction and time dilation to happen. So they co-opted this experiment, and then of course through the equivalence principle, general and the general and special theory are linked together. So while they couldn't explain it through the special theory, even though they have means of deriving circular explanations through relativity, your circular rotation, they didn't want anything to do with this, but they did bring it in through the general theory, and this is how they did it. That's the mechanism by which they say that it works. So they explicitly say that the Sagnac effect is due to rotation, and it's not due to any sort of preferred direction or anything like that. So they've kept it within the confines of relativity in that regard. So 1925, this is Michelson and Gale and Pearson. And what these gentlemen did is they built a giant underground interferometer. They vacuumed out these tubes here, and they measured a variance in the speed of light relative to the latitude. And the way that they explain this through heliocentrism is they say that that the Earth, so the Earth is rotating 1,000 miles at the equator, and then so like at the 45th latitude, it would be rotating at like 750 miles per hour or something like that, and then at the North Pole it would be rotating 0, right? So that speed fluctuation, they say that rotation relative to the latitude is what is causing the variance in C there. So that's how they extrapolate the they use this experiment as evidence for heliocentrism by saying that this is verification of Earth rotation, even though this apparatus is exactly the same as the Michelson-Morley apparatus, which I'll get into how all these interferometer experiments are essentially the same. I'll get into that towards the end. But the mathematics that they used here, they say, so just to point it out real quick, they say that this is based on Earth rotation, and the velocity and all that is derived on an ether fixed hypothesis. So what they mean by ether fixed hypothesis is they're using a fixed reference frame to measure the relative speed of light going from the pipes going east to west and the north-south pipes. And that's where they're getting their variance in the speed for the measurement. So when they say that they're using a fixed ether and all that, like that's what they're talking about. So they didn't do any relativistic corrections or anything to derive this. This is just looking at it and saying, how fast was the light going on these pipes, and how fast was it going in these other pipes facing a different direction, right? Let's see here. So they do make a note here that says that this prediction or whatever is in accordance with relativity, but not sure how that could be if they didn't want anything to do with Sagnac's thing, because what they end up saying as well is that Sagnac measures Earth rotation as well. So all the while after the Michelson-Morley experiment happened, so from 1905-ish to 1925, a man named Dayton Miller conducted, forget how many experiments it was, but he did 5,200,000 measurements of interferometry measurements throughout the year, or throughout 30 years, rather. And then, taking the measurements at different times throughout the year, he found that there is a fluctuation in the speed of light that varies corresponding to the motion of the sun. So in the northern hemisphere, the translational speed of the sun meeting 15 degrees per hour would be slower, right? Because it has to cover a slower distance. And if we live on a plane, it has to go faster. So it, as it goes into the southern hemisphere to maintain the 15 degrees per hour. So that fluctuation in speed, Miller measured to the day on the equinoxes, where the fringe shift patterns reach their minimum and maximum dimensions on the equinox to the day. And he did extensive repetitions of this experiment, doing various control factors and and accounting for criticisms of his experiments, mainly temperature variations and seasonal effects and stuff like that. But when you plot his data against diurnal seasonal time, there's no cause and effect relationship with the variance in C. Well, when you plot it against sidereal time, i.e., what's going on with the sky, it shows a fluctuation corresponding with what would happen if the sun had to pick up its translational speed. Like if the universe itself or whatever was rotating faster, then the mechanism to facilitate that translation of motion, the ether, the tailwind that the light is catching, right? That's making it propagate faster. That fluctuation is happening. Is what he's measuring essentially, right? Now, he, just to throw it out there and not present it as if this is explicit flat Earth evidence or whatever. But Dayton Miller was a heliocentrist, and the way his interpretation of it is how they say the Earth is on an elliptical orbit, and to facilitate that, the Earth would have to be 4 times a year. The Earth would have to be going slower and faster. It would have to go through that mechanism to complete its orbit. So that was his interpretation of what he was measuring, but just at a way slower amount. Now through different correctional factors, of course you can get into they can extrapolate whatever kind of motion they want out of it. But I just wanted to put that just wanted to represent that accurately, because the way I went into the first explanation of it was for a flat Earth of it. But so his interpretation of it was that he made the heliocentric measurements that Michelson didn't measure, but he just measured them to a way slower degree. Now mainstream science had already moved on from this point, because they said there was no ether, all motion's relative, can't measure it, and they couldn't risk more people measuring the variance of C in relation to Earth's motion and getting something that doesn't correspond to what would be needed to facilitate heliocentrism being true. And so they just handwave dismissed his work, after he died. They character assassinated his work when he could no longer defend himself. But while he was alive and doing the experiments over the course of 30 years, his work speaks for itself. So, and I think I had added some quotes of what Einstein said about it, and I'll read it later at the end here. So moving on to 1942, we have Dufour and Pruner, who so with the rotating Sagnac device, they attributed that effect to the rotation of the device itself, right? So what these two gentlemen did is they just had a circular device set up that wasn't rotating, and what do you know? They started getting the same readings and the same variance, and they couldn't, relativity couldn't explain it. So Paul Lavue came in and was like, "Hey, I got you on that math." And what he found was that, so in relativity, the speed of rotation at any point of a rotating disk could be explained from any position on the disk, any reference frame on the disk. It shouldn't matter. And what they found with this, how relativity was trying to explain the variance from the center of the disk, they couldn't make the corresponding prediction. So it showed that there was a preferred reference frame, and Paul Lavue couldn't save him on that one. So this was Dufour and Pruner. And then here in 2002, we have Yuri Galev reproducing Dayton Miller's experiment. And this is especially important because what Dayton Miller found was that when you go to altitude, you get stronger readings for the ether wind effect, meaning that the translation of motion is coming from the sky and it's not coming from the rotation of the Earth or anything like that. Like there would be no reason that there should be a discrepancy on the globe. The reading should be the same at any altitude. So this is Yuri Galev doing the same experiment with optical wave bands, and then he later did it with radio millimeter bands as well. So this is his data plotted over sidereal time as well, showing the same relationship where it fluctuates to the day on the equinoxes. And this is from his other I think this one was from the optical bands, or this one was from the radio band. Yeah, this is from the radio bands. So this was from the 2002 one. Okay, and then in 2004 we have the generalized Sagnac effect by Ruyang Wang, where this gentleman took a fiber optic cable made a conveyor belt situation out of it here. And what they expected to find was that the bits that are rotating would be the bits that would contribute to the rotation. Um, or I'm sorry, that the rotation of the that's going on right here on this part of the conveyor belt is what would contribute to the fringe shift pattern. But what they found is that this linear motion also contributes to it. So the later explanations for the Michelson-Morley experiment and how it couldn't measure Earth's orbital velocity because it's a linear speed and all that, and Earth's traveling on a geodesic path and whatnot. They got rid. They said that they shouldn't expect that fringe pattern and all that. So they they apply second order corrections to Michelson-Morley, and then for the Sagnac effect, they say that this is just Earth rotation, so they don't have to apply any special corrections or anything like that for that. But what this is showing is that this effect that they said was explicitly due to rotation is due to more than just rotation. This is due to which direction the device is actually orientated. So every time he would orient this or would change the orientation of the device, what he found was that the readings going east to west, the propagation is faster, and when it's going west to east, it's going slower, and it depends on the direction, and it's not due to any sort of rotational effect. Otherwise, if it was explicitly due to rotation, as they need it to be, really, to provide heliocentrism evidence through relativity, only the rotational bits should be contributing to the fringe. So just to recap what that means mathematically here. So for the circular derivation, we have delta t equals 4 omega a over c squared. And what they're saying here is 4 times the rotational speed of the device times the area of the device over c squared will give you the amount of fringe shift pattern produced. So what Wang did in his experiment, he had a linear equation, which is he had your delta t, which is your fringe shift pattern produced, is going to be equal to 2 times the velocity times the length of the device over c squared. So the key important parts to note here is that it's the only thing that's important here is the motion, right? So the velocity, the linear velocity, the rotational velocity, all are producing the same effect. It's not just due to one or the other. And also, of course, corresponding to the direction as well. And then your area is just the length of the device, of the length that the path of light has to travel. So in a fiber optic cable, if your cable is 1,000 meters long and it's in a spool, it's going to be, your area is going to be 1,000 meters. So same concept with the length for the linear conveyor apparatus that Wang made. So this is Hector Minera in 2006. This is they made a classic Michelson-Morley interferometer. So no rotation or anything like that. They just had it fixed, orientated to the direction of what they assume would be Earth's orbit and all that. And they left the apparatus in this experiment. They left it running for 3 years continuously. And what they found was that they matched Dayton Miller's work, but the way that they interpret it is they imply a different set of correction factors to it, and they say what they're actually measuring is the motion of the galactic motion, right? So the motion of the what is it called? The sun through the Milky Way or whatever. So they just, through a different correctional mechanism, they just got a higher number out of the reading, but they measured the same thing over 3 years, the same fluctuations that correspond relative to the day on the equinox. So to close out here, we're almost done, I swear. Thanks everyone for listening. So to close out here with GPS, what Wang pointed out about the speed of light being relative and proportional to the velocity of the observer. The accuracy of GPS reflects this using its range measurement equation and the ECI reference frame, which is a stationary non-rotating reference frame. And the range measurement equation is basically just it's a time interval system. So what they're doing is just taking a snapshot of when the signal was sent and when it was received, and the difference in the speed of propagation that it would take to get to, the distance or whatever, right? So that's how they're coming up with GPS accuracy. And what they found was, so if you have a stationary receiver here and a moving receiver here, and you send a signal, at the exact moment that these two are intersected, the moving receiver will receive his signal with a delay that'll be proportional to his velocity, even though the distance that these two gentlemen are the exact same. So this is a huge contradiction to special relativity. This is an exact prediction of what would be this is exactly what you would expect if there's an ether, right? All motion would be relative to the ether. Electromagnetic propagation would be relative to it. So your motion relative to the ether would change how you receive the speed of light, and that's the accuracy of GPS with a first order measurement is entirely dependent on that, and that's how that works. So the velocity of the observer is proportional to the delay in which they receive their propagation of light. And I had a video here of Ron Hatch reiterating that, but we've been listening to me speak for a while, so I'm just going to skip ahead here to where they show it in the frame from the manual. Let's see, 1 second. All right, since the receiver, oh shoot. All right, well, whatever. Anyway, to close out here, it says that, since the receiver is in motion or whatever, you have to account for that, and Jen, just do it, don't worry about it, blah blah blah. And that's a direct contradiction to relativity theory, because if the relativity theory were true, then those two receivers should receive the signal at the exact same time if they're at the exact same distance in that moment in time. So at the end and then I wanted to close out here. So this is a hot topic in flat Earth and all that, and in the argument of geocentrism versus heliocentrism and all that. So just wanted to say, at the end of the day, we all believe in different things, and that's okay. My buddy Jim Waterworld said that, and I think that's a great quote. So with that being said, I'd like to open the floor to anyone that has any questions. I'm happy to discuss.
Nice, dude. This is great. Yeah, and I got a question, but it's kind of a long one. So you started with, is Michelson-Morley an experiment? And I think the easy answer is a resounding yes to that. I went through the components, what makes an experiment. You outlined the method. We outlined the types of variables that we use and how they were manipulated to derive the results that they got. And then I think we can say there's an overwhelming series of measurements of the motion of something, right? Whether it be the translation of motion from the sidereal rotation of the sky, or what they've misinterpreted as earth motion. There is a measurement of motion. There's millions of measurements of motion, and the only two possible frameworks that I can think of to interpret this motion would be a stationary ether and a moving earth, or a moving earth and a stationary ether, right? So then I can't see any other way in which those measurements of the Michelson-Morley and subsequent experiments can be interpreted. Do you know of any other framework in which that data and measurements can be interpreted?
No, if you have a different, the only way you could interpret it differently or whatever would just be to hand wave dismiss it wholeheartedly, right, and just not acknowledge the significance of it or the implications either way, because you have to to acknowledge it and go through it and look at it and understand it. You have to have a framework of interpretation, or at least understand the two frameworks that are put forward and why they're why they are the why they had them, right?
So then what would you call a person with a stance that, I guess, negates all these measurements and doesn't say anything? Like the people who poo-poo on the ether and the interferometry stuff and don't understand the relevance of the variance of the speed of light and the Sagan effect. How would they interpret these, let's say Dayton Miller's 5,200,000 measurements with interferometry showing this pronounced effect?
Well, you would have to take an actual anti-science approach, right? Because these were science experiments that were done. These are repeatable effects by all standards. They should meet the rigid natural science approach, natural phenomenon, right? Electromagnetic propagation is a natural thing. They have a framework to interpret the speed of that propagation. They can accurately make predictions based off of it and all that. So I don't see why it would why you wouldn't use this or make an effort to understand it and utilize it, because it's a powerful weapon once you realize that the interpretation of it is just that. It's an interpretation, based on trying to fit it into a framework that doesn't, through unscientific means to fit it into a framework that is claimed to be scientific when the scientific interpretation of it was there the whole time and doesn't require any crazy corrections or reference frame transformations or abstract math to describe it.
Right? Rock on, man. I mean, yeah, well, does anybody else have any questions, comments, concerns? Because I mean, like the more important part and the thing that we reiterate every time, and the thing I think about every time I hear you give one of these presentations, which is like 12 now, I think, is that all these serious interferometers and these measurements with such sensitivity that they had to put the device in a pool of mercury to stop getting the gentle quakes of the earth interfering with everything. They are all well within the threshold to measure Earth's orbital velocity, which was the original intention of setting up these experiments and was the original intended fringe pattern to measurement. That's what it was based on. They were trying to detect that, and then they tried to fit it into a pattern where they could actually detect half of Earth's a spinning motion, and we'll call that heliocentrism, even though we firmly needed both of these measurements, and one is substantially, more measurable and more vicious and violent than the other. So we should, if we can detect one, we absolutely unequivocally should be able to detect the other. No one's ever done that.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially with what Wang showed in 2004, like the significance of that is that they absolutely should be getting the readings to that because, um, they turned around and hinged everything on a linear geodesic path and all that. So it's like Wang came along and was like, "Hey guys, I got great news." Turns out it should be measured.
Well,
But even on top of that, GPS should also reflect that as well because the motions should be added together if the Earth is spinning into the orbital velocity, right? And it would have to be because that was the explanation for length contraction and time dilation. So
dude,
they've already capitulated to agreeing to that mechanism existing, but that measurement doesn't exist in GPS. So that's a direct contradiction as well to the interpretation of length contraction and time dilation of Michelson-Morley.
right? And like the magnificence that is Wang, the linearization of the Sagnac effect. Like for those who haven't done or like look into what this would mean, it means that for the entirety of this debate, right? We've compared interpretations of the motion of the translational motion of the sidereal motion of the sky. They've said they've measured Earth's rotation, with actual interferometry and the historicity of the size of the movement. You find they've just been measuring the motion of the sky with varying degrees of specificity with a whole bunch of instruments. So what Wang did by linearizing that effect and removing angular rotation as a cause said that actually you can no longer take the interferometry measurements of the sky and associate that with Earth spin. That's not what that is. That can no longer be done. So when the whole debate has been about the different interpretations of the measurements of motion, they are now definitively in the flat Earth, stationary Earth moving rotational ether camp. That's why it's important.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And then so looking further into the Wang experiment, you can even find some papers, or there was a review that someone did on it that showed how, because of how he directionally orientated the device and because of its conveyor belt nature and its motion versus the assumed Earth rotation and all that, and how it would cancel out, he actually created a lab frame that is equivalent to actually being at rest. So he showed that because of the how the effect still persists through that the Earth is stationary with respect to an ether wind, which is a very important distinction because when you look at the history of the ether theories and all that, everyone on all these big physicists and big name mathematicians and all that all have varying theories on the ether, and they were all trying to explain different phenomenon of the ether, and they all, but fundamentally, they all actually adhered to an Earth in motion and stuff. So a lot of the interpretations that you'll hear about a stationary ether or an ether wind is in respect to a mechanism that's facilitated by the rotation of Earth and all that. But the difference here is like it's literally just a coordinate system transformation to reinterpret it as a stationary Earth with respect to an ether wind, and that's actually exactly what the ECI reference frame, how you could interpret that with how they use it in GPS, because that's actually like that's why they use it, because it's stationary, non-rotating with respect to an ether wind. And so the effects that they measure in that frame which is the variance in the speed of light, which is what is producing the accuracy of GPS, is all facilitated by that.
All this technology is based on this known and taking advantage of preferred propagation for directional speed of light, and then they turn around and say, actually, no, it doesn't exist. Like, well, actually,
Yeah,
well, satellites wouldn't work with the range measurement equation based on the quantification of the induction of the rate of illumination, which we now have a useful quantification for, and a metric that we can use to, do simple tasks.
yeah, exactly, dude. So not only is it ether technology, all electromagnetic propagation, excuse me, is ether technology. One second, I'm looking for the equation here. This oops, it's not it. This one. So we've all heard of Maxwell and Maxwell's equations and all that. Um, so before Maxwell made changes to what's called Maxwell's equations, what his contribution to what his further contribution to the equations were is what he added this term here that says that you don't need any charge potential for an electric field to generate a magnetic field, when in fact that's never been experimentally verified. So this mathematic term here I don't know if you can see my mouse highlighting it. Can you guys see this? Highlight. Okay, you can see it, so you're good. So anyway, this term here is just saying that if there's no charge potential, it'll still propagate and the field will self-induce a magnetic field. But this is done with no experimental evidence in the 150 years since these changes were made. And also a change was made to Faraday's law Ampere's law no, maybe it was Faraday's, to compensate for this change, because it's a contradictory term here, the way that he did this. But yeah, there's never been an experiment to show that that an electric field can self-induce a magnetic field, so it can't create a wave like that. That's what this guy's whole paper was about. He goes over radio wave propagation and the changes to the
Wait,
equations. It's a very interesting paper. What's that?
so you're saying that like electromagnetic waves needed an energetic background through which to propagate through to actually extend themselves, not to perpetuity, but past the point of attenuation of any normal wavelengths of light. But now,
Yep. Let me see if I can pull up this picture I took that'll help
but
explain. That'll add a graphic to it. But yeah,
so if they remove the background that they needed, the energetic background through which it needed to propagate, then they mathematically said, well, actually, the magnetic field induces the electric field. The electric field induces the magnetic field, and they will, self-masturbatory propagate each other into infinity. And then that's how that works now mathematically. That's insane.
yeah. Oh, I didn't take the picture, but let me see if I can pull it up here. Yeah, that's exactly what they said. Photon dipole diagram. Nope.
So before they were like based in logic and reason, and they were like nothing can propagate forever. It has to propagate through this energetic background, and everyone agreed. And then they were like, actually, no, we don't need that. It'll just self-propagate itself in perpetuity with nothing needed. And they were like, yeah.
Yeah. So the only way to create a radio wave, right, an electromagnetic wave, is for the charge potential to accelerate. So the acceleration of that will cause the electric field to accelerate, and that acceleration induces the magnetic field. So if you look at this diagram here, you have the acceleration of the magnetic field, and then perpendicular to it is the magnetic field, right? So at the intersection points in between here, there's a charge potential. That's what mathematically is being talked about here with this variable here, permeativity or permeability. Can't remember which one, but that's what that's saying, right? Like, what's carrying the charge potential and allowing this field to induce another field. And when he added this term, right, he said that, well, you actually don't need anything at this intersection point to facilitate that field generation. That just the movement of the electric field will will uh, will self-induce that magnetic field.
Does anyone think that's scientifically well reasoned and no problem? Like,
Yeah, it's really interesting when you look into it because it's like we've never not been in an ether framework. People have just done some fancy math to like act like it doesn't exist and disguise
yeah,
the effects of it as length contraction and time dilation, which is like a
now that
nonsense. Like imagine the power you would have over people if you were in like a secret society that like did like science and all this stuff like at the cutting edge of all this, and you understood the ether and propagation and all that, but you had everyone else thinking that like that doesn't exist and that there's a second order correction that has to be applied, like a literal fairy tale that you have to correct for. And because you do it mathematically, you think you're part of the fairy tale and you think it's real, but it literally goes nowhere and has no purpose and describes nothing that has any relationship to do with the phenomenon that you're observing in reality.
that's the crux of it, though. That's the trick of heliocentrism, essentially. The mathematical transition, dude. It's a mathematical coordinate system transform from a planar to a to a conical system with a ceiling of infinite height, and there you go. That's the best way to describe it.
Yep.
They took away
All
the
right.
atheistic framework and gave us crap, and that's why nothing's ever progressed since. But this is great, man.
Yeah. Yeah, Einstein's theories were brought in and to stifle a physics revolution, right? Because imagine the implication of like, oh, the Earth's stationary, there's an ether background. Like, imagine the direction of science that of how things could have went in terms of energy harvesting, utilizing technology, being honest about how it works, and and all that. Yeah, and not having like these things where it's like,
Couldn't
oh,
have that.
the only way you're gonna get brought into the fold is if you like, uh, you're participating in one of these like government funded operations, and then like they, pull your work because it's actually relevant to some other project that they know, how they know how the actual mechanism works, and they bring you into it and like sort of thing. So it's like very secretive, and there's not going to be like an open discussion about it, and that's what's allowed this stifling of it, right? And then so through that, you just have everyone running around doing these nonsense calculations, living in a Dungeons and Dragons
Well, and then
relativistic overlay.
like when they're trying to repeat these experiments, they're not trying to repeat them with the accuracy of Dayton Miller to get the same results. They're like, what we got to do? Let's do them worse. Let's put them in basement. Let's make the arms different lengths. Let's do
Yeah,
everything we can to fuck up the results of these measurements so that we can get as close to zero as possible.
dude, how about this? They do all that to ruin their own accuracy of the measurement, and they still get a measurement.
Of
They
course,
can't not get away from it. They of course they attribute it to instrumental error at
dude.
that point,
Dayton
but
Miller's like,
they're still in effect. And Dayton Miller literally called all of the effects that they would use later on to discredit him experimentally and use this tending towards zero,
right.
and how they would facilitate that by changing the dimensions of the arms of the apparatus, the medium of the tubes, and all. It's just like cool,
Dude,
man.
that's so ridiculous. He was like, "Hey, guess what? If we go closer to the sky, the changes more." They were like, "Interesting. Word. Let's do it in the basement with different fucking length arms." It's like, what?
Let's do it in the yeah, let's do it in the sub basement. Ugh, it's like what? So, but
I,
yeah,
I don't think
but
any
yeah, that's how
Globers
they
have.
roll.
I don't think all the
Yeah,
Globers left.
that's cool, man. Well, if anyone has any questions about the experiment or anything like that, hit me up because otherwise, I'm gonna go ahead and end my stream here, and then we can go on discussing whatever else we want.
So quiet. I think that's like your superpower, man. You quiet a whole room. None of the Globers want to talk anymore.
That's because Michelson-Morley just disproved the ether.
Right? Like how dumb does Wikipedia seem with all this context now?
Yeah, so exactly what Napalm said, man. Like if surface level narrative of this is like it's framed in a way that's super positive for heliocentrism. They try and make it seem like it's very cut and dry, even though they're applying relativistic corrections for this experiment and not another experiment, even though they're literally the same. And you know, it's really fascinating. And but the big takeaway is just like, as long as you can disprove the ether, you're good to go. Right. Like they don't want you to look into the other aspects of it, or they don't even really talk about why people, like, what it means for everything to be relative to the ether, for all motion to be relative to an absolute reference frame, and why the speed of light varies relative to your motion, like like how the ether is the mechanism that facilitates that. So it's like, if that effect exists, like, you can logically just deduce, like, oh yeah, there's a background medium. Like, that's just,
Actual
it's not.
profundity.
There's
Yeah,
no
like,
background medium because we can shine light through a vacuum where we've evacuated everything. So, what say you about that? Huh?
yeah. So the propagation through the vacuum is exactly why why there is a background medium.
So, you're telling me we can't have waves without something waving?
I mean, what's the natural antecedent to a wave, my dude? Something to be waved in, right? Some sort of medium to facilitate that motion.
Space time. Space time.
Exactly, man. And that's why it's like, space-time's the fabric of the universe. And it's like, what the heck does that mean? It doesn't mean anything, man. It just means that some dudes came up with math that abstractly conforms a coordinate system to the variance of the speed of light proportional to how much that variance was, to make it seem like light doesn't vary. It's like, oh, cool, man.
Right. Do you think that they came up with space time as a conceptual idea that has physical effects, even though it's conceptual, because they needed the physical effects that ether had in order to even perpetuate their bullshit to begin with?
I think that it was such a catastrophic failure that they didn't get a friendship pattern corresponding to what they would need to say the heliocentrism is real, that it just freaked them out really bad, and they were panicking, right? Because when you look at Einstein's math and his framework and the history of it, it's actually all plagiarized. He contradicts his theory in his own works. He writes people in private letters, directly contradicting things that he says in public letters about his theory. For example, he says that he had never seen Lorentz's theories or anything like that about the ether contraction or anything like that. And in a private letter to his wife, he wrote that he needed to, step away for a little bit and focus on Lorentz's explanation to the Michelson-Morley experiment, and like really analyze what was going on with the motion of uh what is it, moving bodies and electrodynamics or whatever. So like he already knew about the Michelson-Morley experiment. He knew about Lorentz's theory. He knew about all of it. But publicly he's like, oh no, I don't know nothing about it. Like, and then he'll later say like, oh, I was thinking about it, the Michelson-Morley experiment, on my own, but he doesn't reference Lorentz's work. And even though his entire work is predicated on Lorentz transformations, it adheres to Lorentz covariance, Lorentz symmetry, and all that. Um, he doesn't give him any credit in his work, and he says that he didn't do that, or he came through this on his own, but he it's literally the exact same framework, identical, and it's just like stitched together, and then through how they had to change the math to evolve it to establish and maintain covariance, which is how they were establishing the quote unquote known laws of physics, and how they were going to transform them to different reference frames, and maintain the validity of saying all, the speed of XYZ is the same in all reference frames. The mechanism by how they were going to validate all that, they had to change the mathematical framework. So when they came up with when Einstein started using absolute differential calculus, and he started using metric tensors, they could change the boundary condition, or the input initial condition, or the boundary condition. So meaning the space time metric tensor, um, or the stress tensors that basically are your conservation laws, right? So they can get any result they need to out of the math. So um, it was really appetizing for them to like put forward this framework, because you could literally explain anything with it. and just use by swapping out the necessary tensor. If you have that freedom, you can literally turn anything into a relativistic explanation. And I think that was like a big goal that they kind of realized or like came to as they were trying to cover up the Michelson-Morley experiment. And when Einstein's work was, coming through, even though it was like all plagiarized and stitched together, they were like, we have to put this through because, it gives us such leadway to explain everything.
Yeah, so it's like Einstein adopted the Lorentz contraction, but gave it no physical mechanism because he understood that he needed a physical mechanism within
No,
his theories, right? Is that kind of the
no,
idea?
he removed the physical mechanism, meaning the ether, because if there's an ether, then there would be a variance in the speed
Right.
of
We
light.
kept the math.
Right, right. So, but the way that he removed the physical mechanism, though, was saying that there's no ether, and that the math, like the description, the coordinate system, conforms to C through length contraction and time dilation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but he had no like actual physical evidence for that, right? It's just
Oh
a
yeah. None at all. None at all. So that's why the general theory, why they had to like rush it through with such with such hastiness, really. So it was linked through the equivalence principle mathematically, so that gave it some bolstered credibility to what they were trying to do with it. And then they gave two calculative predictions with the theory, which doesn't really mean anything. So the big thing that they needed was for Eddington's observations to be true, so that they could establish a cause and effect relationship with the description of space-time to say that, okay, this is actually a description of the physical mechanism that's causing this shortening of a wavelength, that's causing the contraction of an apparatus and all that, right? Because otherwise it's just abstract math. And they didn't get the cause and effect relationship results that they needed, and that's why the whole entire story about Eddington had to be it's told to us like he made these measurements and saw starlight bending and all that, but when you look into the actual story, what you'll find is that he only seen displacement in the so-called solar limb of the sun, which there's already assumed to be a medium of a magnetic field and a electric field and a what's it called, plasma and all that, and the dense conditions, with regards to that. So to extrapolate that any displacement, if there was any, that it was solely due to space time, contracting around the sun, you couldn't make that cause and effect relationship. And then actually, if you go to Stellarium right now, go to 1919. May 29, 1919, go to the island of Principe off the west coast of Africa and look at the solar eclipse. You won't find any stars near the solar limb. They made the entire story up so that they could reify the mathematics, so that they could booster both claims and hide the fact that the Earth's orbital velocity has never been measured, and they
Yep.
and that their commitment to removing the mechanism of the ether was a solid move, because what they actually found was that space time is contracting and all this, and gravitational fields, etc. So the space time mechanism, they linked the equivalence of that with acceleration to gravitation with the equivalence principle with the general theory, and that's what allows them to explain anything through these mathematics, through this framework, through special or general relativity.
Well said. That was a good one. It always keeps coming back to that pesky Earth's orbital velocity, right? The easiest thing they should definitely have a million times over, and have
No,
been
dude,
so
they should
elusive
have.
that they've never found it. Yeah, it's like the Wile E. Coyote chasing the Roadrunner, dude.
Yep, it's purely a mythological beast at this point, right? It's literally like a centaur. It's like, did I just see Earth's orbital velocity? Did I get the reading? And it's like, no, but I did draw a bunch of abstract math next to the reading that infers that the reading could be extrapolated into a bigger reading. And it's
Dude,
like, all right, cool,
they
man.
were like, I didn't get Earth's orbital velocity, but someone stamped their feet in Australia, and the ripple that it caused through the Earth actually messed up my reading. So we're gonna have to put it in a tank full of mercury to make sure that doesn't happen. Still no Earth's orbital velocity. I wonder why.
Yeah, and I mean, the implications, it's pretty straightforward too, because it's like, if we're not orbiting the sun and that's not existing, we're not rotating, and you can't explain these effects through rotation, then we're stationary. And if mass isn't attracting mass in the way that they say it is through gravitational effects and through space time, and it's more of a pressure mediation um, through a medium. And it's like, oh, then they don't have a way to say like, oh yeah, we're a rotating ball.
Right.
Like it takes away so much of their ability of
So
the overlay that they have on reality
so
with the
many of the
mathematics.
tenets are struck at the heart by the foundation that you're trying to lay. Well, I mean, like, well, most of your work is just bringing the legendary work of the old G's to light in a nice, cohesive manner to pass on. Because most of all the measurements and experiments have been done by the legends of history who have been buried and not taught to any of us, the likes of Dayton Miller.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, man. If it was as cut and dry as it seemed, with the thing like thanks Bob and all that, like we would have readings at the equator from these gyros, we would have readings in the south, but they keep that data obfuscated. We don't have axis gyro readings in the south or the equator. Like all of these things would provide make or break um, evidences, for the
Right.
globe and all that, and that they're just not there. And they explicitly use things that are in the southern hemisphere. So in terms of single axis gyros, they actually make it a point to have two labs that are around the same latitude, around the 45th latitude, and their correction angle to Polaris, they say that they're actually aligning to Earth's axis of rotation to get the strongest readings to get their like 15 degrees per hour and all that. So they make it publicly available and known that their correction angles are about 45 degrees at these latitudes. So it matches what would be consistent on a flat Earth, right? If you're just
Right.
aiming at the
So
sky,
they're equal at that
you get
point.
to get these measurements. And this is single axis gyros, keep in mind, or ring laser gyros. So for like an inertial navigation system, you're not going to be changing the orientation of it or anything like that because it has an additional gyro per each axis, and then it has additional, depending on the apparatus, has additional gyros mounted as well to take those readings, so it doesn't have to change its orientation or anything to get the readings. It'll just figure it out by averaging out how much it's getting a reading. So, but these things would be like really solid. Like this would be stuff they would be doing in high school. Like how they do the Cavendish, and they're like, oh look, the balls and all that, and they used to do that in high school apparently to prove mass ejecting mass. They would like schools would have like their interferometer, the single axis interferometer at their high school, and you would measure the daily rotation relative to your latitude and all that. Like it would be like a huge thing if this effect existed in
Yeah.
the way that it would have to be symmetrically to prove a globe in the way that they tried to co-opt the explanation for it. And the
The,
fact that stuff doesn't exist and it's obfuscated and hidden just kind of tells me that it doesn't exist for a reason.
Yeah, the other thing about those readings in the south and talking about the skies, like as far as the celestial sky optics goes, and like the optics induced kind of rotation of the South Pole, that I'd like to argue, since we can't actually measure any other rotation aside from the one around Polaris, it would lend itself to logic that there is only one rotation of the stars in the sky all over Earth. There is no second counter or partial or quadruple or anything like that. Or we'd have measurements that would indicate something like that as far as an alignment to an axial rotation with an interferometer, right?
Yep. Sorry, I didn't hear what you said. I just agreed blindly, but I'm
Yeah,
sure it
it's all right. I was
was
right.
you're tight, tight, tight.
Those pesky southern axial aligned interferometer readings.
Yep. So in combination with with repeating Miller's work, that's pretty huge, right? So we have, let's see how many people repeated his work. All right, so we got Miller himself, who did it for 30 years straight. So, how do you count that? Do you count that as one singular guy doing it? I feel like if you do 30 million or 30 years of experiments and 5,200,000 measurements or more, like
That's
that.
like 1,000 legendary G's.
Yeah, okay. So this was replicated 1,000 G times, right? And it was replicated here by Yuri Galev in 2001 and in 2002. and it was replicated by Monera in 2006. And it's like, why aren't more people doing this and replicating it? And I bet you there's not a lot of funding in disproving the biggest lie in history. So, all right. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and close the stream out.
Hey,
What's up, G? Oh, what up?
hey, what's up, buddy? Hey, so like the guy that was doing the interferometry with the radio waves, like
Yes.
what can you kind of explain like the significance of like what he did?
Yeah. So just using a different type of electromagnetic propagation and then a different device, and he was just sending out the signals, and they were, propagating faster or slower corresponding to the equinoxes.
Oh, wow, okay, I get that now. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's another interesting tidbit, right? Like, so if we are measuring the motion of the sky, and the motion of the sky speeds up and slows down necessarily as it goes from the Tropic of Capricorn to the Tropic of Cancer, then the translation of motion would correspondingly speed up and slow down. And wouldn't you know, interestingly, that's exactly what they measure with an alarming degree of specificity.
Yeah, so it was essentially like a different way of measuring it, but getting the same results, right? I mean,
Yep.
it was
Yes.
significantly
Exactly.
different, right? Okay.
Yep. And then so that the last one that I covered, the Hector Monera guy that did the classic interferometers or Michelson setup that left it running for 3 years. That one, shoot, I just lost my train of thought in relation to what you said.
It was a different mode of.
I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. It was super. The way that they did their apparatus, like more accurate and all that. They actually had some criticisms of Michelson-Morley, of their setup, and they made their efforts to be even more accurate and have a better air tolerance and all that. And they measured the exact same fluctuations corresponding to what Miller measured, but the math framework that they used to interpret it, they used a different transformation equation set that allowed them to get a higher speed out of what would be needed for the contraction. So they said, so their claim is that they measured the speed around the speed of the sun going around the center of the galaxy or whatever. They say that they measured it at 320 kilometers a second or whatever, but they didn't, like, it's still the same measurement as the Michelson-Morley.
So no matter what, the rotation of the Earth has never been measured terrestrially.
So the sidereal rotation of the sky has been measured in relation to whether or not it's the sun or the Earth or not. There hasn't been any direct measurements until Ruyong Wang in 2004, where the distinction made from his experiment is that the Earth is stationary with respect to an ether wind because of the rotational effects and how they were trying to explain the Sagnac effect to begin with. They would the natural interpretation of Wang's work is that the Earth is actually stationary with respect to an ether wind.
Oh wow, thanks for clarifying that. That's amazing.
Yeah, because I
Right?
guess you could. Because I guess to be fair, you could interpret it either way. For the Sagnac, if there's not a linear explanation for it, you could very well go, okay, yeah, it's detecting Earth rotation, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, in 2004, that was a huge change. Like that should have been. How people say,
Nobel
wouldn't you
Prize.
win?
Yeah.
Yeah, wouldn't you win the Nobel Prize for
You,
disproving Einstein? Where's your published paper? Well, your boy Wang in 2004 did exactly that, and nobody's throwing a parade for that guy because of the fact of the implications of what that is. Because not only were they wrong a little bit, they were completely wrong about everything,
right?
right? Like, so they can't, like, they're not going to overturn
Well,
it or do any mechanism for that.
it's like I said, dude. It's like the whole crux of the argument when they're like, "Haha, stupid flurps. We've measured Earth's rotation. Thanks, Bob, etc." All that nonsense. When you're like, "Well, actually, we've linearized the Sagnac effect so it can specifically exclude, angular rotation as a cause of the interference pattern." So now, literally, all the arguments that we've had debating whether the measurement of motion is actually supposed Earth rotation or just a translation of motion from the sidereal rotation, all that's answered now and it's definitive and we're right. So I don't know, like I don't know how else to go forward.
Yeah, it's pretty cut and dry once you get a good understanding of what's going on, and it's like, oh, you know, it's like Modder Builder was saying the other night when he started looking into differometry. He was like, oh yeah, like that's crazy.
So
Just
that's over, right? You
it,
have no measurements of rotation of any kind. You have no motion of any kind. If the tenet of heliocentrism is Earth spinning and Earth's orbital velocity, you have failed to measure either now. And before there was just a bunch of nebulous, opaque crap where we could pick and choose. Well, actually, what are you measuring? You're saying it's Earth spin, but it coincides with the seasons, and you have to align it to the sky. But okay. So now any measurements of motion of the sky, just we know that based on these measurements are actually measuring the translation of motion from the sidereal rotation. That's a fact. Literally all the globe is left.
yeah, oh gee,
It's okay. It mostly wasn't for them, to be honest. It's to build the foundation upon which the flat Earth position should now be built. Like we shouldn't be in the camp of ignoring scientific measurements and the specificity of 5,200,000 experiment or measurements of this motion, right? Like we should embrace it as a position, and like we keep saying, the only two interpretations are, stationary ether, moving Earth, moving ether, stationary Earth. And quite clearly it's shown to be a moving ether and a stationary Earth over and over and over again.
amen, amen, brother, as they say in the South or wherever they say that. But yeah, um, it's really strong evidence for a stationary Earth with respect to a stationary or with respect to an ether wind. And using this as an argument takes away their bigger arguments and reveals the deception of special relativity, the relativistic framework, right? Because it's not, because this, the implication of it isn't just flat earth or rotating earth or whatever. They obfuscated, like they remade physics based on this interpretation so that they could continue a an endless mathematical framework labyrinth that our smartest men and women will just get lost in, thinking that they're coming up with all these, relativistic explanations that fit within the framework, and none of it's real. So it's
Right?
very important to bring this argument to the forefront because it's just the implications are just it's literally it's in everything, man.
Right? Just to reflect quietly on how smart you thought you were when you thought you understood space time 10 years ago, watching a History Channel special or whatever the hell, but how the universe was made. Like, oh.
Yeah, they literally just dazzled us and told us all this stuff and built it all and and put it all on Einstein and said that he was the one that came up with all this. And then you look at the history of the math and you see that it was all taken from other people, stitched together. He gives contradictory explanations to his own framework and his own postulates upon which his math is built upon. There's that incident with Paul Gerber where his equation is completely identical, and his explanation is that,
Yeah.
"Oh, I've never seen Paul's work, so how could I have stolen his equation?" Got you. Like, okay, dude, you literally said the same stuff about Lorentz, and in a private letter to your wife, who did most of your math, you're talking about how you're going to go study hard on Lorentz's ether theory and how his explanation to Michelson-Morley, and then you and then your whole special relativity framework adheres to Lorentz covariance, but you don't cite them in your work. It's like, there's a it's all made up,
That's like
It's
a
all
kid like getting caught eating a cookie with cookie all over his face, being like, "No, I didn't." I'm telling a bullshit lie. No, I didn't eat a cookie. And fuck you for
no,
asking.
equations just look identical. Well, we came to the same conclusion based on different mechanisms. Like,
But ev-
okay, dude. So for a second time in Einstein's career, boys, I'm gonna pull up the equation here in a second so we can all look at it. For the second time in his career where his framework matches someone else's exact equations of an ether theory, because Gerber was an ether lad, and he set the propagation of the gravitational wave or whatever it was to be to match the speed of light or whatever through an ether mechanism. So that's what his math was. Then Einstein came along and changed two symbols, right? And didn't even change one that much, right? Like that's just a lowercase t, boys. So, or I'm sorry, that's just an uppercase t. And he's like, no, I didn't steal that equation. That's not. I've never seen his work. It's the same one. He did it again.
Tinfoil hat.
Whoever did that, he came up with his explanation 17 years before Einstein gave his equation to predict the perihelion precession.
Well, that's why we should get everyone to watch this wonderful, an hour-long video on the historicity of the fraudulency of Einstein. Was Einstein
Oh,
a fraud? Is how
absolutely.
it's framed, but it's like an hour of action-packed details of the actual of the history of all the things that he stole, how dumb he was when he said it, how all the actual critiquing scientific minds at the time literally tore it down, and then everything got obfuscated, hidden, and we were raising him up to worship as a sky god.
Yep. Sky prophet.
Yeah, sky
He,
prophet.
pre-
Yeah.
he predicted that a math equation would collapse in on itself, causing such a gravitational disturbance that it would curve space-time infinitely in perpetuity such that not even light could escape from it, and it would just infinitely eat everything that gets within a certain radius of it.
Yeah, everyone should go watch that one podcast. I think the guy who renders is kind of annoying, but the guest he has on is an absolute gem full of information.
Yeah, the history of it is crazy, man. And then when you look into how his wife was basically behind the scenes
Yep.
facilitating all the math, and then like he even says in his closing, uh, or like one of his last letters to her, because she's like, I'm about to go public and tell everybody what's up. Like I'm tired of being that secondhand, hand me down wife or whatever. And he's like, well, listen, if you tell everyone what's up, then you won't be like the prestige and everything won't be valid and you'll ruin everything anyway. So like don't do it. And then she didn't, she was like, oh yeah, I guess you're right. And then he was like, I'll give you the $50,000 from the what's it called? The Nobel Prize that he got. And he did. He gave her the 50K, paid her off. So
Informative hour and a half.
yeah, dude, it seems like it was longer than that, but it's only been an hour and a half, huh?
It's a solid hour and a half. Jam packed.
Solid. All right. Well, cool. I think we'll wrap up my YouTube stream then there. If nobody else has any questions, comments, or concerns.
Bravo, Alan. Bravo.
Thank you, sir.
Well done.
All right, Shane, I'm going to go ahead and cut off the tubes. Thank you, everyone, for coming out and watching the stream and or coming to the Discord and participating.
If it's part of the show. Welcome to the show.